37, the $5 AMISH floor polish that lasts 30 years. Why the hardwood industry buried this recipe. The morning light catches every board. You know the kind of floor. Oak planks worn smooth by boots, dogs, chairs dragged across them, and years that seem to pass without asking permission. Yet somehow the wood still glows. Not like a showroom floor. Better than that. Honest. Lived in. A few years ago I stood in a farmhouse where the hardwood looked decades younger than the house around it. The kitchen cabinets had scars. The porch leaned a little. The screen door spoke every time it opened. But the floor would not surrender. The number that stayed with me was 5. Not 500, not 50, $5. That was what the homeowner claimed a batch of his family's floor polish cost to make. No contractor. No specialty coating, no miracle product in a shiny bottle, just a jar, a rag, and a habit most people stopped practicing long ago. And the more I looked into that floor, the less the mystery seemed to be about wood. The morning light catches every board. You know the kind of floor. Oak planks worn smooth by boots, dogs, chairs dragged across them, and years that seem to pass without asking permission. Yet somehow the wood still glows. Not like a showroom floor. Better than that. Honest. Lived in. A few years ago, I stood in a farmhouse where the hardwood looked decades younger than the house around it. The kitchen cabinets had scars. The porch leaned a little. The screen door spoke every time it opened, but the floor would not surrender. The number that stayed with me was 5. Not 500, not 50, $5. That was what the homeowner claimed a batch of his family's floor polish cost to make. No contractor. No specialty coating. No miracle product in a shiny bottle. Just a jar, a rag, and a habit most people stopped practicing long ago. And the more I looked into that floor, the less the mystery seemed to be about wood. The floor sat in a farmhouse built long before anybody worried about matching finishes to paint samples. It was not perfect. There were scratches near the back door, a few darker marks around the kitchen table, the kind of wear that tells the truth about a home. What caught my eye was not perfection, it was endurance. The boards still held their color. They still reflected the morning light. They still looked cared for. Most of us have walked across hardwood that cost a fortune and looked tired after 10 years. This floor had seen far more life than that, yet it carried itself differently. That difference stayed with me. As we talked, I expected to hear the usual story, maybe a professional refinishing job, maybe some expensive treatment repeated every few years, maybe a product recommended by a flooring specialist. Instead, the homeowner shrugged and pointed toward a shelf near the pantry. There sat a plain glass jar, no label, no logo, no promise printed across the front in bold letters, just a jar. He explained that his family had used simple, homemade wood care mixtures for years. The recipe changed a little from generation to generation, but the idea stayed the same. Care for the wood before it begins asking for rescue. That answer bothered me more than it satisfied me. Not because it sounded wrong, because it sounded too simple. We live in a time when every problem seems to require a specialized solution. One bottle for this surface, another bottle for that surface, one cleaner for daily use, another for monthly use, another for restoring what the first two supposedly protected. Walk through any hardware aisle and you will see shelves full of promises. Yet here was a man standing on a floor older than many modern houses, pointing toward a plain jar and speaking as if none of that complexity was necessary. Now, to be fair, old methods are not automatically better. Some traditions deserve to stay in the past. Every generation learns new things. Every material behaves differently. That matters. But there is another truth hiding beside it. Sometimes a useful practice disappears not because it failed, but because something newer arrived with a louder voice. Many homeowners have discovered this with tools, garden methods, food preservation, and household maintenance. The older way often survives quietly in barns, workshops, and farmhouses long after the advertisements move on. That possibility is what kept pulling me back toward that kitchen floor. I remembered a neighbor from years ago named Earl. Earl was not a man who wasted words. His workshop smelled like sawdust and machine oil. Every tool had a place. Every board scrap had a reason for being saved. He once told me that you could learn a great deal about a household by looking at its floors and its hand tools, not because they needed to look expensive, because they revealed habits. Neglect leaves signs, so does care. You could see which homes treated maintenance as a burden and which treated it as part of ordinary life. At the time, I nodded and moved on. Years later, standing on that farmhouse floor, I understood what he meant. The more you look around, the more you notice a strange pattern. Modern homeowners often wait until something looks bad before giving it attention. The finish dulls, the wood dries out, scratches multiply. Then comes the search for a solution. Yet many older households approach things differently. They expected wear, they planned for it. Small acts of care happened before visible damage arrived. A few minutes here, a rag in a jar there, nothing dramatic, nothing worth bragging about. But over years, those small actions stacked up. The floor benefited, the furniture benefited, sometimes the entire house benefited. There is a reason that idea feels unfamiliar today. A great deal of modern business depends on replacement, restoration, and recurring purchases. That does not mean anyone is plotting against homeowners. It simply means companies naturally focus on selling products. The kind of company that profits when maintenance is simple and infrequent rarely grows as quickly as one selling a new solution every season. Over time, attention shifts, packaging improves, marketing expands. The humble habits that once lived in kitchens and workshops slowly fade from view, not because they vanished, because fewer people kept talking about them. And that brings us to the question sitting quietly beneath the title of this story. Was the secret really hidden inside a $5 mixture? Or was the mixture simply supporting something far more important? Because the deeper I dug, the less this looked like a recipe story, and the more it looked like a lesson about how wood behaves when people stop fighting it and start working with it. The answer begins with a way of thinking that many families once considered common sense, and that way of thinking changes everything. The people who built many of those old homes rarely talked about hardwood floors the way we do now. They did not treat them as decorative features. They treated them as part of the structure itself. A floor was expected to outlive the people walking across it. Tradition holds that many farm families looked at wood the same way they looked at a fence post, a workbench, or a barn beam. You cared for it because you planned to keep it. That single assumption changes everything. When something is expected to stay for generations, maintenance begins looking less like a chore and more like stewardship. A small investment of time protects a much larger investment later. That mindset shows up all over older homes. A grandmother oils hinges before they squeak. A farmer sharpens a tool before it becomes dull. Carpenter wipes down a handle before it cracks. None of those actions seem important on a single day. In fact, they almost disappear into ordinary life. But years have a way of rewarding steady habits. The problem with many modern maintenance routines is not that they are wrong. It is that they often begin after damage becomes visible. By then, you are repairing instead of preserving. The old approach was quieter. It aimed to prevent trouble before trouble announced itself. That distinction matters more than most people realize. A neighbor once showed me a shelf above his workbench. 3 jars sat side by side. One for leather, one for metal, one for wood. Nothing fancy, no colorful packaging, no instructions folded inside a box. Just simple mixtures he had used for years. He told me that his father kept a similar shelf, and his grandfather before that. The jars changed. The ingredients changed. The principle stayed the same. Materials last longer when they receive regular attention. Looking back, I think those jars represented something bigger. They were physical reminders that maintenance belonged inside the household. It was not something outsourced every time a surface lost its shine. That idea feels almost rebellious now. Walk through a home improvement store, and every problem has its own aisle. Every aisle has its own collection of promises. Some products work well, some do not, most fall somewhere in between. But the underlying message stays remarkably consistent. Buy another solution. Buy another treatment. Buy another formula. Again, this is not about villains wearing black hats. It is simply how markets operate. Companies make money by selling products. Families save money by extending the life of what they already own. Those two goals occasionally overlap. Sometimes they move in different directions. The wise homeowner learns to recognize the difference. What fascinates me is how many old maintenance practices survived, despite never being heavily marketed. Nobody built giant campaigns around wiping down a wooden handle before winter. Nobody launched national promotions around oiling a squeaky hinge. Yet, people kept doing those things because they saw the results with their own eyes. Floor worked the same way. Many traditional households understood that wood is not a dead material. It moves, it dries. It responds to moisture and neglect. Treat it well, and it often rewards you. Ignore it long enough, and eventually the bill comes due. The floor in that farmhouse seemed to be living proof of that simple principle. At this point, some folks expect a dramatic revelation. They expect the hidden ingredient, the secret substance, the mysterious element that transforms ordinary wood into something nearly indestructible. The truth is less exciting and far more useful. Most traditional wood care mixtures relied on familiar materials. Materials people could understand without a chemistry degree. Materials available through general stores, farms, workshops, and household cupboards. The power was rarely in one magical ingredient. The power came from matching the treatment to the nature of the wood itself. Once you understand that idea, a lot of expensive promises begin looking less impressive than they once did. There is another lesson hiding here. The old families who practiced these habits were not chasing perfection. They accepted wear, they expected scratches. They knew life would leave marks. What they wanted was graceful aging. They wanted wood that remained healthy, useful, and attractive despite years of service. That is a very different goal from achieving a flawless showroom appearance. A floor that reflects real life often carries more character than one that never gets used. The farmhouse floor taught that lesson quietly. It did not look untouched, it looked cared for. Those are not the same thing, and confusing them has cost homeowners a great deal of money. So the question changes. Instead of asking whether an old homemade mixture can outperform every modern product, we arrive at a better question. Why did so many traditional families trust simple oil and wax based treatments in the first place? What exactly were those mixtures doing to the wood? And perhaps most important of all, what are the limits that honest people should understand before trying them today? Because the answer is not hidden in folklore. It is sitting in the relationship between wood, time, and a plain glass jar on a shelf. The traditional mixtures many homesteaders talk about usually begin with two ideas instead of two ingredients. The first idea is that dry wood benefits from gentle conditioning. The second is that the surface benefits from a light protective layer. That is why many old recipes combine some form of oil with some form of wax. The exact ingredients varied from family to family. There was never one official formula. One household used what was available locally. Another relied on what a parent taught them. What matters for our story is not the exact recipe, but the reasoning behind it. The mixture worked with the wood rather than trying to overwhelm it with chemistry or shine. In many traditional approaches, the oil served as the nourishing element. The wax helped provide a modest barrier and a soft finish. Neither was expected to perform miracles. That is an important point. Modern advertising often trains us to expect dramatic transformations. Old household maintenance aimed for something different: slow improvement, steady protection, a natural appearance. When people describe floors that stayed attractive for decades, they are usually describing years of repeated care, not one afternoon of treatment. The jar mattered. The habit mattered more. The mixture was simply a tool supporting a long-term relationship between a homeowner and the materials inside the home. If you decide to explore a traditional oil and wax approach, start small. That advice alone can save a great deal of frustration. Find an inconspicuous section. Observe how the finish reacts. Different hardwood floors wear different finishes. Some older floors welcome these treatments. Some modern factory-finished floors may not respond the same way. This is where honesty matters. A homemade mixture is not universal. Anyone claiming otherwise is asking you to ignore the differences between materials. In my experience, careful testing is a sign of wisdom, not doubt. The goal is not proving a tradition right. The goal is protecting your floor while learning what works for your particular situation. One mistake people make is assuming more product must mean better results. Old-timers often believe the opposite. A thin application, worked carefully into the surface, frequently produced a better outcome than a heavy coating. Too much oil can attract dirt. Too much wax can create buildup. Excess often becomes its own problem. The best maintenance routines tend to feel almost boring. They are measured, consistent, unremarkable. Yet those are often the routines that survive for generations. A floor does not care about excitement, it responds to care. That truth sounds simple because it is simple. Some of the most valuable household lessons usually are. Standing in that farmhouse kitchen, I eventually realized the floor itself was distracting me from the larger lesson. I kept looking at the result while overlooking the process. The result was beautiful, the process was ordinary. That is what made it powerful. The homeowner did not wait until the wood looked exhausted. He paid attention before that moment arrived. A little maintenance here, a little maintenance there. Over years, those small actions accumulated into something visitors noticed the moment they walked through the door. Many of life's durable things seem to work that way. Marriages, gardens, workshops, even friendships often thrive through steady attention rather than dramatic rescue efforts. That is why the phrase buried recipe deserves a little caution. Older methods did not necessarily disappear because somebody locked them away. More often, they faded because habits changed. Families became busier. Specialized products became more common. Convenience gradually replaced routine maintenance. The knowledge was never entirely lost. It simply moved farther from the center of everyday life. Yet every generation contains people who keep certain practices alive. A grandmother saves seeds. A neighbor sharpens hand tools. A retired carpenter keeps a jar on a shelf because his father kept one before him. Knowledge survives through people long before it survives through books or advertisements. The real thing being preserved, then, is not the floor. It is the mindset behind the floor: stewardship, patience, respect for materials. The belief that taking care of something today is often cheaper than replacing it tomorrow. That lesson reaches far beyond hardwood. It touches roofs, fences, tractors, cast iron pans, pocket knives, and countless other things sitting around homes across the country. Many older Americans already know this in their bones. They grew up watching people maintain what they owned because replacing it was expensive and often impossible. In some ways, that wisdom feels more valuable now than ever. Inflation has a way of making old lessons look young again. Before we finish, I'd like to hear about a piece of practical knowledge that stayed in your family. Maybe it was a maintenance trick. Maybe it was something your father taught you in a workshop or your mother taught you at a kitchen table. Those lessons often tell us more about a family than any photograph ever could. And next time, we're going to look at an old wooden tool handle resting beside a coffee can in the corner of a workshop. Most people walk right past it. A few older craftsmen never do. Once you see what they understood, you'll never look at a worn tool handle the same way again.